Welcome to my YouTube channel. Hit the like button, share your thoughts, subscribe and tap the bell icon. The chalk snapped in his hand. He didn't expect her to speak. Not like that. The class had gone silent. Even the fan seemed to stop. It was as though time itself held its breath. She stood near the blackboard. Wrinkled hands. Worn sandals. A loose brown shawl clung to her shoulders, its fabric faded from years of use. She looked like someone's lost grandmother, not someone who belonged in this room, not someone who should even be here. For the past 20 minutes, she had sat quietly at the back of the classroom, the only one not glued to the computer screen or scribbling notes. The others had their eyes on him, the teacher, as he stood at the front of the room, confidently writing an impossible equation on the board. Everyone knew it. No one could solve it. "I'm sure some of you have seen problems like this before," Mr. Harris had said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "But this one? This one's a real challenge. It's unsolvable. Not even the brightest minds in mathematics can crack it. Not even the top students at Harvard." He had smiled smugly as the students nodded, some of them staring at the problem as though it were a puzzle from another planet. But she wasn't staring at the problem. She was staring at him. A few minutes earlier, he had walked past her seat, half expecting her to be dozing off. But she wasn't sleeping. She was looking at the equation. Her eyes locked onto it like it was the only thing in the room. No distractions. No hesitation. Mr. Harris couldn't help himself. He had to say something. "You'll never solve it," he had muttered under his breath, barely audible to the class. "Not at your age." It was meant to be a joke. A harmless comment. A way to remind the class how difficult the problem was. But when he glanced at her, he noticed she wasn't smiling. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't doing anything. Just staring. Staring at the problem like it was a challenge. Then, in a flash, the chalk snapped in his hand. His fingers tightened involuntarily as the sound echoed through the room. She was standing now. You can't be serious," he stammered, his voice betraying his unease. She didn't answer. Her eyes stayed on the blackboard. For a moment, everything in the room seemed to slow down. The students, usually so eager to fill the silence with chatter, were completely still. No one dared move. The room was thick with tension, as if they all knew something was about to happen. Something no one could predict. "Is this the equation?" she asked, her voice soft, almost a whisper. But there was an unspoken force behind the words, a quiet certainty that made him shiver despite himself. He had expected laughter. He had expected her to fumble. At best, she'd give up halfway through. That was what happened with every other student who had tried. They all gave up. They were all too scared of the complexity. But she didn't falter. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "You won't solve that, ma'am," he said, his words sharp and dismissive. "Even my top students gave up." But she didn't blink. Her eyes stayed locked on the board. She picked up the chalk. Her fingers trembled. Not from fear. From age. From years of wear. From living a life long enough to have seen things that most of the students in this room would never understand. But despite her age, despite her fragile appearance, her grip on the chalk was steady. He could feel the unease creeping up his spine. She moved to the board, making the first mark with a precise motion. It was almost too quick for him to register. A line. A simple line. And then a symbol. Then another. The students watched in silence, their eyes darting between the teacher and the old woman. Some of them whispered, trying to figure out what was happening. Was she really going to attempt it? Could she? Did she even know what she was doing? But no one could look away. Mr. Harris's face turned serious. This wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to solve it. He had created this problem for the most brilliant minds. He had carefully chosen it to stump anyone who dared try. It wasn't just a mathematical equation. It was a puzzle, a test of genius, a demonstration of intellectual power. But here she was, writing on his board, as though it were the simplest thing in the world. Her hand moved with a fluidity that surprised him. There was no hesitation. No fear. She didn't stop to think. She didn't need to. She erased part of the equation. The part that he had written. The part he had thought was impossible to solve. The part where everyone before her had given up. Mr. Harris watched as she rewrote it. Her chalk hit the board like a whisper, leaving no trace of uncertainty. His eyes followed the movements. The steps. The formula. He couldn't understand it. Couldn't believe it. He had taught math for over 20 years. He had seen it all. The complex problems, the frustrated students, the moments when someone had come close but faltered at the last step. But this was different. He couldn't even follow her logic. Every move she made was like a piece of a puzzle falling into place. She didn't stop. She didn't even look at him as he stepped closer to the board, his heart pounding in his chest. The students were as still as statues, their eyes glued to her. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick slower now, as if the room was holding its breath. A bead of sweat formed on his forehead. His throat was dry. He swallowed hard. He had never felt this powerless in front of a class before. But there she was, standing at the board, doing something he couldn't explain. She finished. She stepped back, her face still calm, her eyes never leaving the board. The teacher stared at the equation. He had seen many answers in his career, but this was something else. It didn't make sense. It couldn't be right. There was no way. But it was. It was perfect. Every step. Every symbol. Every number. Perfectly balanced. Exactly what the equation had asked for. The room was silent. Not even a whisper. Not even a breath. He took a step forward, but his legs felt heavy. His mind raced. How? She turned to him slowly, her face unreadable. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm. That's the answer. He stared at the board, his mind reeling. The numbers didn't add up. The steps didn't make sense. The answer was wrong. It had to be. But it wasn't. He opened his mouth to speak, to say something. To explain it away. To tell her it was impossible. But no words came out. The students shifted in their seats, their eyes darting from the teacher to the woman and back again. Some of them looked confused, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Others were on the edge of their seats, waiting for something. But it wasn't the answer that terrified Mr. Harris. It was the way she looked at him. Like she had seen this before. Like she had done this before. Like she had known exactly what to do from the start. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. It was all he could manage. Her lips curved into a smile. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't even a smile of satisfaction. It was something else. Something deeper. She didn't answer him immediately. She just looked at him, as though she were studying him, weighing his very soul. Finally, she spoke. "I was there." The room went dead silent. The words hung in the air like a fog. The students glanced at each other, puzzled, unsure if they had heard right. I was there," she repeated, her voice quieter this time, but still filled with that calm certainty. "I've solved far worse." Mr. Harris stared at her, his mouth dry. And then he realized, he had just witnessed something he could never explain. something that had shattered his understanding of everything. But that was only the beginning. Cliffhanger, Mr. Harris could only stare. He wanted to ask more questions. He needed to understand. But deep down, he knew he would regret it. The story she was about to tell would shake him to his core. The class was still silent. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall, a sound that now seemed unbearably loud in the stillness. Mr. Harris stood frozen, his gaze fixed on the old woman at the front of the class. Her words echoed in his mind, repeating over and over, "I was there." He couldn't wrap his mind around it. He had been a teacher for over 20 years, and never had he come across something like this. No one had ever solved that equation. No one had even come close. And yet, she had done it with such ease, as though it was a simple task, like she had solved problems like it 1,000 times before. The students began to shuffle in their seats, the tension in the room palpable. No one knew what to say. No one knew how to react. They had all witnessed something extraordinary, but it felt too surreal to comprehend. Was it a trick? Was she some sort of savant, or was there something else at play here? Mr. Harris blinked and took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had to regain control. He had to maintain his authority. "Ma'am," he finally managed, his voice shaking slightly. You can't possibly expect me to believe this. That equation is unsolvable. I've worked on it myself for years. No one has ever been able to crack it." The old woman didn't flinch. She merely smiled softly, the faintest trace of amusement dancing in her eyes. "I'm not here to convince you," she said calmly, her voice unwavering. "I'm here to remind you that not everything is what it seems." A cold shiver ran down Mr. Harris's spine. He tried to steady his breath, but it was like a dam breaking inside him. There was something unsettling about her presence. Something that made him feel both small and insignificant, as though she knew something he couldn't even begin to understand. "You..." Mr. Harris began, but his words trailed off. "Who are you?" She didn't answer him right away. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the chalkboard, where the equation still sat, its perfect solution staring back at them. The silence stretched on, stretching his patience, testing his nerves. Finally, she spoke again, her voice softer now. "You wouldn't understand," she said quietly. "Not yet. But I'll tell you a story. One that you'll remember for the rest of your life." Mr. Harris swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He didn't know why, but he couldn't stop himself from wanting to hear her story. It was like a thread being pulled inside him, drawing him closer to the unknown. The students were still watching, their eyes wide, their curiosity piqued. They, too, wanted to know what she had to say. They wanted answers. "Tell us," one of the students, a young woman in the front row, spoke up nervously. "Please. What do you mean? How did you solve it?" The old woman turned her gaze on the girl, her eyes sharp, yet full of something far deeper than what the teacher had expected. Her gaze held a lifetime of experiences, of stories that hadn't yet been told. "Many years ago," she began, her voice low and steady, "I was in a place much like this. A classroom. But not quite. You see, when you grow old, time seems to slip away. The days blur together, and you forget the little things. You forget how you ended up where you are." Mr. Harris leaned in slightly, his curiosity growing. He hadn't expected this. He had expected deflection. Denial. But instead, she was offering him a window into her past. A past that, somehow, felt like it was just as tangled and complex as the equation she had solved. "I wasn't always old," she continued, "at least, not in the way you see me now. I was once like all of you. Young, eager, filled with the promise of the future. I was studying mathematics at a university, much like the one you might attend someday. I was brilliant, some would say. I had a mind that worked in ways that others couldn't quite understand. Her eyes took on a faraway look as she spoke, and Mr. Harris found himself hanging on every word, as though the weight of her story was pulling him deeper and deeper into her world. But life has a way of changing things. It has a way of breaking you down, of making you forget who you really are, she continued, her voice softer now. I never thought it would happen to me. I never thought I would end up in the place I did. The classroom was still, as if the air itself was holding its breath. It was the war, she said, her voice tinged with sadness. It took everything. My friends, my family, my dreams. One day, I was a student, focused on my studies. The next, I was running for my life, hiding in places I couldn't even name, trying to survive. Mr. Harris felt a chill creep down his spine as she spoke. He had heard stories. Everyone had. Stories of war. But to hear someone speak so openly about it, it was like he was hearing it for the first time. It was real. It was personal. And it was terrifying. I lost so much in those years, she went on, her voice steady but filled with grief. And yet, somehow, I found a way to survive. But survival came at a cost. I learned things about myself that I never wanted to know. I learned that the mind, no matter how brilliant, can be broken. That sometimes, the hardest equations aren't the ones written on a chalkboard. They're the ones inside your own head. Mr. Harris felt his breath catch in his throat. He had no idea where this was going. But he couldn't stop himself from listening. Something about her words, something about the way she spoke, made him feel like he was on the edge of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. I became a different person, she said quietly. But the math never left me. Even in the darkest days, I still solved equations. I still thought about numbers, formulas, patterns. They were the only things that kept me going. The only things that kept me sane. She paused, her eyes briefly meeting Mr. Harris's. There was something intense in her gaze, something that made him feel like she could see straight through him. I was there, she repeated, her voice soft but firm. When the greatest minds were called in to solve problems that no one could even begin to understand. I was there, solving equations that were far more complicated than the one you wrote on that board. Her words hit him like a punch in the gut. He wanted to ask more questions, to understand. But something told him that the answers he sought would only come at a price. What happened? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. She gave him a small smile, one filled with sorrow and understanding. What happens when you solve an equation that no one else can? You become a part of the problem. The room seemed to close in on him. He didn't understand. He didn't want to understand. But he had no choice. The story had taken a turn, and there was no going back. You see, she continued, her voice growing more intense, the equation you wrote? It wasn't just math. It was a test. A test for something much bigger. Something that no one should ever have to face. Mr. Harris felt his heart race. He had heard stories of tests like this. Dangerous tests. But he never imagined he'd be a part of one. He had no idea what was coming next. The old woman's gaze never wavered as she spoke. I was there, in the thick of it. Solving equations that people would kill for. But the real question wasn't whether I could solve them. The real question was, why? And for whom? Cliffhanger, the room was eerily quiet. Mr. Harris felt as though he had just uncovered a secret far darker than he had ever anticipated. The old woman's story was only beginning, and he was no longer sure he wanted to know where it would lead. The classroom felt heavy, like the air itself was thick with the weight of the old woman's words. Mr. Harris's mind raced, trying to process everything she had said. She had solved the impossible equation, yes, but her story? It was something else entirely. It felt like they were on the edge of something far darker, something more dangerous than just a mathematical puzzle. The old woman stood still at the front of the class, her eyes never leaving Mr. Harris's. There was an intensity in her gaze now, something sharper than the calm demeanor she had shown before. It was as though she knew something he didn't, and that knowledge made him feel both terrified and intrigued. He had always prided himself on his intellect, on his ability to decipher patterns, to understand things that others couldn't. But right now, he felt like a child, lost and fumbling in the dark. "You say the equation was a test," Mr. Harris said finally, his voice steady but laced with curiosity. "But a test for what? For whom?" The old woman's lips curled slightly, but it wasn't a smile. It was something darker, something far more mysterious. She had clearly been expecting this question, and yet, when she answered, it wasn't with the straightforwardness he had hoped for. "I told you, Mr. Harris," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that made his chest tighten. "The real question isn't whether you can solve the equation. The real question is why they wanted it solved in the first place." Her words hung in the air, dense and loaded with meaning. Mr. Harris's thoughts swirled as he tried to make sense of it all. Who were they? And why would anyone want to solve an equation that seemed so impossible, so meaningless on the surface? He didn't have time to ask another question. The old woman stepped away from the board, her movements slow but deliberate. It was as though she was preparing herself for something, a revelation, maybe, or an explanation that would finally make sense of all the madness. "You want to understand," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "You want to know what's behind the equation. What it represents." Mr. Harris nodded, eager for the truth, no matter how unsettling it might be. "It represents everything," she replied, her eyes locking onto his with a piercing intensity. "It represents the way the world works, how power, knowledge, and fear are all intertwined. It's a symbol of something far greater than any of us could possibly understand." A chill ran down Mr. Harris's spine. His stomach tightened. He had known, in some small corner of his mind, that there was something more to this equation. But now, hearing her speak with such conviction, he realized that it wasn't just a mathematical challenge. It wasn't just a puzzle. It was a key to something far more dangerous. "Tell me," he pressed, though he was almost afraid to ask. "What is it? What's behind it?" The old woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced toward the students, who were still sitting in rapt attention, their eyes wide, hanging on her every word. They, too, seemed to understand that the stakes were much higher than just a simple classroom lesson. They knew that something was happening here, something that none of them had ever expected. "It began long before any of you were born," she said, her voice growing distant as though she were drifting into a memory. "It began with a group of people, mathematicians, scientists, even politicians, who realized something, that the world was changing. The equations that defined reality were starting to unravel. And with that unraveling came the need to control it. To understand it before it was too late." Mr. Harris frowned. "Control it? But, why would an equation have that much power?" The old woman's eyes softened for a moment, as though she was reminded of a past long buried. "Because, Mr. Harris, the equation was never meant to be just numbers on a board. It was meant to unlock something far more powerful. Something that could change the course of history. Or end it." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Mr. Harris felt his heart begin to race. The weight of her words settled heavily in his chest. He had never heard anything like this before. He had always thought of mathematics as a pure science, devoid of the shadowy world of power and manipulation. But now, he saw it differently. The equation was more than just a problem to be solved, it was a tool. A weapon, even. "And you solved it," he said, though the words tasted strange on his tongue. He still couldn't fully grasp what she was telling him. "I solved it because I had no choice," the old woman replied, her voice low, filled with a sorrow that seemed to echo through the room. Because the moment I solved it, I became a part of something much larger than I could ever have imagined. A part of something that wasn't just about numbers and formulas. It was about survival. About staying one step ahead of the people who wanted to control everything. Mr. Harris was silent, his mind racing. He was beginning to understand. The equation wasn't just a test of intellect. It was a test of loyalty. Of survival. And those who solved it? They were marked. They became part of the game, whether they wanted to be or not. But why? Why would anyone want to control something like that? He asked, though his voice was barely above a whisper. He could feel his world crumbling, piece by piece, as the weight of her words settled into him. Because knowledge is power, she said, her gaze unwavering. And when you have the knowledge to control the very fabric of reality, you have the power to shape it. To manipulate it. To create a world that suits your desires. She paused, letting her words sink in. Mr. Harris's breath caught in his throat. He felt as though the ground beneath him was slipping away, as though everything he had known, everything he had taught, was now in question. They needed people like me, she continued. People who could see the patterns, who could understand the equations that others couldn't. They needed us to unlock the secrets of the universe. But what they didn't tell us was that once you knew too much, there was no going back. Her words were a hammer striking the surface of his mind, breaking through the thin veneer of rationality he had clung to for so long. He had never imagined that mathematics could hold such power. That an equation could represent something so dangerous, so destructive. But now, it was all coming together. The equation was more than just a problem to be solved, it was the key to something far darker, something that could shatter everything. Mr. Harris swallowed hard, his throat dry. And what happened to you? What did they do to you once you solved it? The old woman looked at him, her expression unreadable. They made me one of them. I became part of their world, the world of secrets and lies, where nothing was as it seemed. I was forced to work for them, to solve problems that no one else could. And the more I solved, the more they demanded. Her eyes flickered with a distant sadness, but also something darker, a memory that she couldn't quite shake, no matter how hard she tried. They didn't care about me, she said softly. They only cared about what I could do for them. And when I couldn't give them the answers they wanted, they discarded me like an old tool. Just like they do with everyone who's outlived their usefulness. Mr. Harris felt his chest tighten. He had been so sure that this was just a story, just a tale spun by an eccentric old woman. But now, he could see the truth in her eyes. He could see the pain, the fear, the years of suffering that she had endured. This wasn't just a story. It was her life. And you're telling me all of this, why? He asked, his voice barely audible, his heart pounding in his chest. The old woman's gaze softened, her lips curving into a faint smile. Because I want you to understand, Mr. Harris. I want you to understand the danger. The truth behind the equation. And the price of solving it. She paused, then added, you've seen the surface. But there's a deeper truth waiting to be uncovered. And once you start down this path, there's no going back. Cliffhanger, Mr. Harris's mind was spinning. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but there was still so much left to uncover. He could feel the weight of the old woman's words pressing down on him, pulling him into a world he wasn't sure he could survive. But he had no choice. The truth was out there, waiting to be discovered. Mr. Harris couldn't breathe. The weight of the old woman's words pressed down on him like a vice, and the room seemed to close in around him. It was as though he had stumbled into a web of dark secrets, a web that he had no way of escaping. The equation, the puzzle that had brought him here in the first place, was no longer just a mathematical challenge. It was a symbol. A key. A weapon. And he was tangled up in it, whether he liked it or not. The old woman's eyes were fixed on him, her gaze unblinking. She was waiting for him to speak, to react. But Mr. Harris couldn't find the words. He couldn't wrap his mind around everything she had just told him. There were too many pieces, too many unanswered questions. You said there was a deeper truth, Mr. Harris managed to say, his voice hoarse. A truth behind the equation. What is it? The old woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced at the chalkboard, where the equation still sat, as though it were mocking him. He couldn't understand why it was so important. He had thought the equation was just a challenge, something to prove that his knowledge, his intellect, was superior. But now, he realized that it was something far more dangerous. You'll never understand it, the old woman said quietly, almost to herself. Not until it's too late. Mr. Harris leaned forward, his hands trembling. Please, he begged. Tell me. I need to know. She looked at him then, her eyes softening for just a moment. The equation was never just about numbers. It was a way to unlock something that could change everything. The people who created it, who tested it, wanted to control it. To control the future. A chill ran down his spine. He had heard whispers of power and control before, but this? This was something else entirely. Something far bigger than he had ever imagined. They wanted to shape the world, the old woman continued, her voice steady. But what they didn't realize was that once you unlock the equation, it changes you. It changes everything. The very fabric of reality begins to bend, to break, and there's no going back. Mr. Harris's breath caught in his throat. What do you mean, bends? What happens when the equation is solved? She paused, as though choosing her words carefully. It's a signal, she said, her voice low. A signal to the universe. To forces we don't understand. Forces that have been waiting for us to open the door. Mr. Harris felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. He had thought he was dealing with something that could be controlled. A puzzle. A mystery. But now, he realized that it was far bigger. It wasn't just an intellectual challenge. It was a matter of survival. Who are these forces? He asked, his voice trembling with fear. The old woman's expression darkened. I don't know, she admitted. All I know is that they're real. They've been watching us for a long time. And now that the equation has been solved, they know we're ready. Ready for what? Mr. Harris asked, his mind racing. What do you mean, ready? Ready for what to happen? She looked at him, her gaze piercing. For the end of the world, she said simply. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Mr. Harris could hardly process them. The end of the world? Was she serious? This had to be a joke. It couldn't be true. Are you telling me that this equation, this puzzle, will cause the end of everything? He asked, his voice shaking. The old woman didn't answer right away. She merely nodded, her face etched with sorrow. The equation was a doorway. And once it was opened, it couldn't be closed. Mr. Harris felt his legs go weak beneath him. He couldn't believe it. He had thought that solving the equation would be an intellectual triumph, a moment of glory. But now, it seemed like a curse. A curse that had been set in motion long ago, and he was standing at the epicenter of it. Is there no way to stop it? He asked, his voice desperate. There is one way, the old woman said quietly. But it comes at a price. He looked at her, his heart pounding in his chest. What price? She looked at him with a sad smile, as though she had been waiting for this question all along. The price is the one thing that no one is ever truly willing to pay. You have to give up everything. Your past. Your future. Your very identity. Mr. Harris frowned. What do you mean? You're saying I have to. she cut him off. I mean, you have to walk away from everything. From everything you thought you knew. You have to erase yourself from the equation entirely. The words felt like a slap to his face. He didn't understand. How could he erase himself from the equation? He was a teacher. He had a life. A future. A purpose. Was she asking him to give up all of that for the sake of some unknown force, some unknown danger? I can't do that, he said, his voice firm but trembling. I won't. There has to be another way. The old woman's expression softened, but it was still filled with sadness. I understand. But there is no other way. The equation was meant to lead to this moment. And now, the only way to stop it is to sever yourself from the future. To remove yourself from the timeline entirely. Mr. Harris shook his head. I don't believe you. This doesn't make sense. I didn't believe it either, she said quietly. But I was wrong. The room seemed to grow colder, the walls pressing in around him. It felt as though the air was thick with the weight of something terrible, something beyond his understanding. He had solved equations before, but this? This was something else entirely. It was a game of life and death, of survival and destruction, and he had no idea how to navigate it. How do I do it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The old woman stepped forward, her face inches from his. You have to make a choice. You can walk away now, and forget everything. You can return to your life, your classroom, and pretend none of this ever happened. Or you can stay. And if you stay, you must be prepared to give up everything you know. You must be ready to erase your past, your future, and your very existence from the equation. And if you don't, the forces that are waiting, they will come. They will take what they want. And the world as you know it will end. Mr. Harris's heart pounded in his chest. He felt trapped, suffocated by the gravity of the situation. He couldn't comprehend what she was saying, but he knew one thing for sure, there was no going back. The moment the equation had been solved, everything had changed. And now, he was standing at the crossroads. He could feel the weight of destiny pressing down on him, and he had no idea which path to take. Are you ready? The old woman asked, her voice low and serious. He swallowed hard, his mind racing. Could he erase himself from the equation? Could he really walk away from everything? Or was it already too late? I don't know, he whispered. Then there's only one thing left to do, the old woman said softly. Solve the final equation.